In the autumn of 1347, 12 ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors who stumbled off those ships were dying. Their skin was covered in black boils the size of eggs. They vomited blood. They couldn't stand. Most were already dead. The ones still alive wouldn't last the night. The harbor officials took one look at the crew and ordered the ships to leave immediately. Get out. Go back to wherever you came from. But it was already too late, because those 12 ships didn't just bring spices and silk from the east. They brought something else. Something invisible. Something that couldn't be turned away at the harbor. They brought the apocalypse. Within days, people in Messina started dying. Within weeks, thousands were dead. Within months, the disease had spread to every major port in the Mediterranean. And within 3 years, it would kill between 75 and 200 million people. 1/3 of Europe's entire population. Gone. Erased. This was the Black Death. And once it began, there was no stopping it. To understand what happened, you need to understand what the world looked like in 1347. Medieval Europe was a place of extremes. Magnificent cathedrals rose above cities of filth. Kings lived in stone castles while peasants died in mud huts. The Catholic Church controlled everything. What you believed, what you read, how you lived, how you died. Life expectancy was 30 years if you were lucky. Most children didn't survive to adulthood. Famine was common. War was constant. But people endured. They had endured for centuries. They believed God had a plan. They believed their suffering had meaning. They had no idea that everything they knew was about to end. The disease didn't start in Europe. It started in Central Asia, somewhere in the steppes of what is now Mongolia or China. Historians believe it originated in rodent populations, carried by fleas that lived on rats and marmots. For years, maybe decades, it existed in isolated pockets, killing small communities, burning itself out. But then something changed. The Mongol Empire, the largest land empire in human history, had created trade routes that connected east and west like never before. The Silk Road brought goods, ideas, and people across thousands of miles. It also brought disease. Merchants traveled from China to the Black Sea. Soldiers moved between battlefields. Rats stowed away on ships and caravans. And the plague moved with them. By 1346, the plague had reached a Mongol army besieging the Italian trading port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. The Mongol soldiers started dying by the hundreds. Their commander, desperate and furious, decided to use the corpses as weapons. He ordered his men to load the plague-ridden bodies into catapults and hurl them over the walls into the city. It was biological warfare, medieval style. The Italians inside tried to throw the bodies into the sea, but it didn't matter. The plague was already inside. Terrified, the Italian merchants fled Kaffa. They boarded their ships and sailed home, to Genoa, to Venice, to Messina, and the plague sailed with them. The first symptoms appeared within days of infection. Victims developed fever, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea. Then came the buboes, swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits and neck, black and oozing pus. The pain was unbearable. The smell was worse. Some victims developed a second form of the plague, pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs. They coughed up blood and died within 24 hours. A third form, septicemic plague, poisoned the blood, turning fingers, toes, and noses black with necrosis. The disease moved fast. You could feel fine in the morning and be dead by nightfall. There was no treatment, no cure, no hope. Medieval doctors had no idea what was happening. Medicine in 1347 was based on the writings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians. Doctors believed disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed bad air, miasma, carried sickness. They bled patients. They gave them herbal concoctions. They consulted astrological charts. Nothing worked. The best doctors in Europe were helpless. And as the plague spread, the doctors started dying too. From the ports, the plague moved inland. It followed trade routes, rivers, and roads. It spread to Florence, where the writer Giovanni Boccaccio watched his city collapse. He later wrote that the sick were abandoned in the streets, left to die alone because even their families were too terrified to help them. He described bodies piled so high that they were buried in mass graves layered like lasagna, covered with a thin layer of dirt. Then more bodies, then more dirt. In some places, there weren't enough living people left to bury the dead. Corpses rotted in homes, in churches, in the streets. The plague reached Paris in the summer of 1348. The French king Philip VI asked the medical faculty at the University of Paris to explain the disaster. The doctors concluded that the plague was caused by a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the year 1345, which had corrupted the air. Their solution? Avoid bathing because it opened the pores to bad air. Stay indoors. Burn aromatic woods. Pray. None of it worked. Paris lost half its population. The king fled the city. The government collapsed. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. In England, the plague arrived in the port of Melcombe Regis in June 1348. Within months, it had spread to London. The English called it the Great Mortality. Chronicles describe fields full of rotting crops because there was no one left to harvest them. Livestock wandered freely, untended, starving. Entire villages were wiped out, abandoned, and never resettled. You can still find these lost villages in the English countryside, empty fields where communities once thrived. By the time the plague finished with England, nearly half the population was dead. The psychological impact was catastrophic. People watched their families die in agony, unable to help. Husbands abandoned wives, mothers abandoned children. The church, which was supposed to provide comfort, was overwhelmed. Priests died in massive numbers because they were constantly exposed while giving last rites. Some priests refused to enter plague houses, which shattered people's faith. If God's representatives wouldn't help, what did that say about God? The social order, which had been rigid and unquestioned for centuries, began to crack. Panic led to madness. In 1349, a movement called the Flagellants swept across Europe. These were groups of religious extremists who believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. They traveled from town to town in processions, whipping themselves with leather straps embedded with metal spikes. They believed that by punishing their own flesh, they could atone for everyone's sins and make God stop the plague. They marched through the streets, chanting and bleeding, sometimes for hours. The Catholic Church eventually condemned them as heretics, but not before thousands had joined their ranks. Others looked for scapegoats. In a time of terror, people needed someone to blame. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells to kill Christians. It was absurd since Jews were dying of plague at the same rate as everyone else, but logic didn't matter. Mobs attacked Jewish communities across Europe. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive. In Mainz, 6,000 were murdered. In Barcelona, the Jewish quarter was destroyed. The Black Death didn't just kill with disease, it killed with hate. Some people reacted differently. They decided that if death was inevitable, they might as well enjoy their final days. The Italian writer Boccaccio described people who abandoned all morality. They drank, they feasted, they slept with whoever they wanted. Churches stood empty while taverns overflowed. Traditional rules, traditional morality, traditional authority, all of it seemed meaningless when everyone was going to die anyway. It was the end of the world, so why not live? But not everyone gave up. Some communities tried to fight back. The city of Milan implemented one of the first quarantine measures in history. When the plague was detected in a house, the authorities sealed the entire building, trapping the sick and the healthy together. It was brutal, but it worked. Milan's death toll was significantly lower than other cities. Venice established a 40-day quarantine for ships arriving from infected ports. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta, which is where we get the word quarantine. These measures saved lives, but they were the exception, not the rule. The plague didn't hit everywhere equally. Some villages were completely untouched, while others were annihilated. No one knew why. We know now that it had to do with population density, sanitation, and luck. Cities were death traps. Rats thrived in the filthy, crowded streets. Rural areas with smaller populations sometimes escaped. But the randomness made it even more terrifying. There was no pattern, No way to predict who would live and who would die. By 1351, the worst was over. The plague didn't disappear. It simply ran out of victims. So many people had died that the survivors were spread out, reducing transmission. But the damage was done. Europe had lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population. England went from roughly 6 million people to 3 million. France lost half. Italy lost half. Some regions lost even more. The city of Florence went from 120,000 people to 50,000. Siena lost 2/3. Some small towns vanished completely. The world that emerged from the Black Death was fundamentally different. The economy was shattered. There weren't enough workers to farm the land. Lords who had once held absolute power over their peasants suddenly found themselves desperate for labor. Peasants who survived demanded higher wages, better conditions, freedom to move. The feudal system, which had defined European society for centuries, began to collapse. Serfs walked away from their lords. They couldn't be stopped because there was no one to replace them. For the first time in European history, ordinary workers had power. The church never recovered. People had prayed, and God hadn't answered. Priests had fled, and the faithful had died alone. The moral authority of the Catholic Church was broken. This crisis of faith planted seeds that would grow into the Protestant Reformation 2 centuries later. Art changed too. Before the plague, medieval art was abstract, spiritual, focused on heaven. After the plague, art became darker, more obsessed with death. Skeletons danced with kings and peasants in dance of death paintings. Skulls appeared in religious art. Artists painted rotting corpses. Europe became obsessed with mortality. Medicine began to change slowly. Doctors realized their old methods didn't work. Some began to question ancient authorities. They started doing autopsies, studying the body, looking for real answers instead of consulting dusty texts. This wouldn't lead to real breakthroughs for centuries, but the seeds of the scientific method were planted. The plague forced people to ask new questions, to doubt old certainties. The Black Death also reshaped the map of Europe. Regions that were devastated never fully recovered. Others rose to fill the void. The balance of power shifted. Trade routes changed. New cities grew while old ones stagnated. The world that existed before 1347 was gone forever. But the plague wasn't finished with Europe. It came back.
What can we do?
In 1361, a second outbreak killed thousands more, this time targeting children who hadn't been exposed the first time. It came back in 1369, and again in 1374, and again for the next 300 years. Plague became a recurring nightmare, a periodic apocalypse that Europeans learned to live with. Outbreaks continued into the 17th century. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed 100,000 people. Marseille lost 30,000 in 1720. The plague only truly ended in Europe in the 18th century, and no one is entirely sure why. The Black Death changed everything. It ended the Middle Ages. It shattered feudalism. It broke the church's power. It made people question authority, tradition, and faith. Some historians argue that without the Black Death, there would have been no Renaissance, no Reformation, no modern world. The catastrophe destroyed the old order and forced Europe to rebuild from scratch. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Black Death is what it teaches us about human fragility. Medieval Europe was convinced of its own permanence. The Church had stood for 1,000 years. Kings ruled by divine right. The social order seemed eternal. And then, in 3 years, half of it was gone, vanished. The plague didn't care about power, wealth, or faith. It killed kings and peasants, priests and sinners, the righteous and the wicked. It proved that civilizations, no matter how grand, are fragile, that everything can fall apart, that nothing is permanent. For centuries, the Black Death was treated as ancient history, a medieval nightmare that could never happen again. We had science. We had medicine. We had sanitation, vaccines, antibiotics. We were safe. We were modern. And then, in early 2020, a new plague began. A virus jumped from animals to humans, It spread along global trade routes. It moved faster than any medieval plague because we move faster. Planes instead of ships, hours instead of months. But the pattern was the same. Hospitals overwhelmed, bodies stacking up, morgues running out of space, governments imposing lockdowns, quarantines, isolation, fear spreading as fast as the disease. The same human behaviors repeated: panic buying, scapegoating, misinformation spreading faster than facts, people refusing to believe the danger was real until it killed someone they loved, others abandoning all caution, deciding to live recklessly because the future felt uncertain. The social fabric fraying under the weight of fear and death. History didn't repeat, but it rhymed. And it rhymed perfectly. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe in 3 years. COVID-19 killed 7 million people worldwide in 3 years, and that's probably an undercount. It didn't kill as many, but it didn't need to. It proved the point. Pandemics are not relics of the past. They are recurring features of human existence. Viruses do not care about our technology, our wealth, or our arrogance. They exploit our biology and our behavior. They spread through the same mechanisms they always have: close contact, crowded spaces, human movement. The diseases change, the names change, but the pattern remains. The Black Death was a warning written in 75 million graves, a warning that civilizations can collapse, that normalcy is fragile, that we are never as safe as we think. But it was also a reminder of something else: resilience. Europe survived. The survivors rebuilt. They created new systems, new art, new ways of thinking. They endured, and we will too. But only if we learn, only if we remember, only if we stop thinking that catastrophe is something that happens to other people in other times. So when you see images of empty streets, masked crowds, and overwhelmed hospitals, ask yourself, is that 1347? Or is that 2020? Does it matter? The plague returned to Europe dozens of times over 3 centuries. Each generation thought they had seen the last of it. Each generation was wrong. Viruses evolve, they adapt, they return. And history, it seems, has a habit of repeating. I'm Victor, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. See you in the next era.